Good evening. Welcome to the Penfield Public Library. We are honored once again to partner with Writers in Books to present the author of the book chosen for their annual event, If All of Rochester Read the Same Book. We have some people to thank for this program this evening. For the funding, we have to thank the Friends of the Penfield Public Library and the Gift and Memorial Fund of the Board of Trustees of the Penfield Public Library. And I would like to thank a few town departments that banded together to make sure we made this the best event ever. And that is the Recreation Department. They provided the venue and helped us to set up. Maintenance Department also helped us with setup. The Security Department will help us take down so we can leave it in a fit condition for whatever's going to go on tomorrow here in the gym. And I'd also like to thank PCTV. We had a record registration this year, and we were concerned that we would not be able to accommodate all people interested in this room, so they set up a live feed to our Bremen room in the library to accommodate the overflow. I'd also like to thank the staff of the Penfield Public Library. It works so hard to make sure this is an enjoyable event for everybody. Let's see. Oh, also, we are partnering this year with the Genesee Valley Quilt Club. Every year, they hold a little bit of a challenge to their members to come up with a wall quilt that expresses the theme of the book that's chosen for the event. And those quilts are on display down in our Bremen room. So when you're done enjoying the lecture and the question and answer period, and before you go down to enjoy the refreshments and the reception that we have for the author down in the library following the lecture and question and answer period, you might want to stop and look at those quilts. Okay, I think we're all set to introduce Joe Flaherty. And it is my great pleasure to do so. He is the Executive Director of Writers in Books, and he will provide a proper introduction to our distinguished guest this evening.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. This is the first day of 2014 if all of Rochester read the same book, and it's always a pleasure to come back to Penfield Public Library. This has been the one institution that has hosted every single year of If All of Rochester Read the Same Book. So this is the 14th year of us being at Penfield Public Library, and we love being here. So thank you, Penfield. And before I introduce our author tonight, I want to introduce somebody else to you, Beverly Gold, who is a volunteer at Writers in Books, and she would like to speak to you for just a little bit about this program, If All of Rochester Read the Same Book, which is one that she is so excited about. Beverly?
Ooh, there's a lot of people up there. As Joe said, my name's Beverly Gold, and I'm a proud member of the Writers in Books Board of Directors. And on behalf of the board, we welcome you to the, as he said, again, the 14th annual If All of Rochester Read the Same Book. Like most of you, I have been enjoying this yearly event since its inception. 14 years, wow. 14 years of hearing some of my favorite authors and of being able to be introduced to writers who have not previously been on my radar. How fortunate we are to have Writers in Books as an integral part of our community. And when you leave, make sure you pick up the new catalog, and you'll see all the wonderful courses for both writers and readers. It's not just for writers, of which I'm not one. Without readers, what would the writers do? I hope that you found the Reader's Guide to be a great resource. I'm always amazed at the number of events that occur before and after the author arrives for their 4-day whirlwind of speaking engagements. I was intrigued by the interview that Karen Van Meenen did with Eowyn, which made me even more excited to hear her this week. This year, for the first time since this program began in 2000, we are asking you to consider making a gift to Writers and Books in honor of If All of Rochester. These gifts will help to defray the cost of producing these really wonderful reading guides and to help continue to bring in fabulous authors like Eowyn Ivey to Rochester so that we can continue to enjoy evenings such as this. And since this is the second event, today's event this afternoon at Nazareth was oversubscribed also. So I think it's a combination of how people are excited about this All of Rochester event and about the author who you'll be hearing as soon as I leave. We have included envelopes in your program, so the envelopes look like this, that can be completed and returned to our volunteers in the library tonight, or if you prefer, mail back to Writers and Books. If you're unable to make a gift at this time, please be assured that we consider your presence tonight a gift to us. Thank you so much, and see you next year. But one more thing. I just want to say I've been checking the average temperatures in Anchorage, Alaska versus Rochester, New York for the last 2 months. And I'm happy for Eowyn, but not happy for us that we're running neck and neck. So, on that note, back to Joe.
Thank you, Beverly. One more thing here. Chris, you want to come out? We want to take a photograph of all of you that we're going to send out. We're going to tweet it out and get it on our Facebook. So
everybody wave. Big waves. Awesome. Okay, go on.
All right. One other thing. In your packet also, there is a questionnaire. And we would love for you to fill that out, give us more information about you and about your interest in literature, et cetera. But we also have on there, we asking you to tell us what is your favorite fairy tale. And we are gathering, and after the end of the program over the next 3 days, we will find out what is Rochester's top 3 favorite fairy tales of all time. So give it a little thought and give us your best bet there. Let me also mention a few other quickly sponsors who helped to make this possible, this entire event, which begins a month or so earlier than this with programs taking place in libraries, et cetera, throughout the community. And that support includes the New York State Council on the Arts and our presenting sponsor locally, Ameriprise Financial, Nanette Noken, private wealth advisor. We also get support from HBT Architects, Flower City Printing, Fred and Floy Wilmot Foundation, Boylan Code Attorneys at Law, Paycheck, Harris Beach Attorneys at Law, and of course, the Penfield Public Library and the Friends of the Penfield Public Library. Each year, we try to find a book that is different than the one we did the previous year, but also different than any of the ones we've done over the past 13, 14 years at this point, which gets a little harder every year. But this year, I think we really found one that is very, very different. We look for a book that's engaging, that's a good read, that stresses our collective sense of humanity, that provides a window into a world that we would not otherwise have the opportunity to look into. And I think we've really achieved that this year with this book, especially after the winter we all spent here together to be reading about Alaska. And I think this book is really something very, very rare. It's utterly engrossing, and it's a novel based on a very simple fairy tale. And unlike any Disney version of the fairy tale, however, this fairy tale, in a very real world. It's the world of Alaska about 100 years ago. It's a harsh world and yet a beautiful one. And it's a place where Mabel and Jack, recent arrivals from Pennsylvania, struggle to make a life for themselves. They are the old man and the old woman of the Russian fairy tale, The Snow Child. Their story and the story of the young girl who miraculously appears and becomes a part of their life is an incredible achievement by the author, entirely true to the original fairy tale, and yet a full-blown, engrossing novel with wonderful and entrancing characters. What we experience as readers in this book is a truly magical literary journey that grips us as few other stories do. And the author of this book is Eowyn Ivey. A native of Alaska, she spent 10 years as a journalist there, working for the Frontiersman newspaper, and also as a bookseller in her local independent bookstore. And we welcome her here to Rochester tonight as the writer who has given us the gift of The Snow Child, this year's selection of If All of Rochester Read the Same Book. Eowyn Ivey.
Wow, what an amazing turnout. This is fantastic. Thank you all for coming out. And first I have to say about the weather, it is true. My grandparents live in Buffalo, and we keep trying to convince them to move to Alaska, where the winters are a little more mild. So, so I think it's absolutely true. First off, I just really want to thank Penfield Library and the entire wonderful staff at Writers and Books. It's just such an amazing thing to pull together and celebrate a book like this, and an honor for me as a writer. But most of all, I want to thank all of you. I mean, something like this can't work unless there's readers reading the book and participating. And this is really phenomenal and moving to see you all out here. So I really appreciate that. What I want to do tonight, I was thinking, is maybe just talk a little bit about how I came to write the book, sort of the process, how The Snow Child came to me as an idea, and read a few passages. But then what I'd really like to do is open it up to questions. I find I enjoy it better if I feel like I'm having a conversation with you all. I get a little self-conscious just up here talking. So if you have any questions about the book, if you've read it as a part of a book group, the discussion you've had, share any of that with me. Or if you have questions about the writing process, my life in Alaska, my next book, any of those things, I'm kind of hoping you'll be thinking in the back of your mind about some questions as I start off here. So I think, as Joe mentioned, I grew up in Alaska in a little town about 70 miles northeast of Anchorage. Any of you who have been up to Alaska? Actually, I'm kind of curious, how many people here have been up to Alaska? Oh, wow, that's a great number. That's wonderful. So yeah, I grew up there, always loving to read, always loving books. I come from a family of avid readers. My mom is a poet, and my dad had his degree in English literature, although they both worked out, they didn't work in the literature field at all. It was just very much a part of what we did in our family. And I always joke, my husband and I have been dating since we were in high school, and I joke he would come over to our house and he'd say, "It's like a library in here," because we were always all reading. It was just something my mom read to me when I was a little girl, starting with poetry and short stories and things. So it was how I grew up, and I knew I wanted to somehow earn my way, earn my living through literature, through words. But I'm also kind of a pragmatic person, and I just realized they weren't going to pay me to just sit around and read books, and I couldn't imagine being able to make a living as a fiction writer. So I ended up getting my degree in journalism from Western Washington University in Bellingham. My husband and I went down there to school, and I came back to Alaska, and the plan was to do a 6-week internship at my hometown newspaper to finish up my degree, and then I'd be off to somewhere else. Well, 10 years later, I was still at the Frontiersman newspaper, and I had worked everything you can imagine, writing police beat, copy editing, everything. But I had this realization at some point where I thought, this isn't my passion. I had never been someone who rushed to the morning newspaper to read the news. I didn't love magazine journalism. What I loved was novels. That's what I'd always loved. So I had to kind of get my courage up and say, I'm going to make this break. I'm going to try this. So what I did is I left the journalism field and went to work at our local independent bookstore. And it was kind of a scary move because I was leaving what I felt like was kind of a real career, not a great paying for those of you who have worked in the news business, but to go just work as a bookseller. But it was actually the best move I could have made. All of a sudden, I was around the people in my community who love literature. I was surrounded by books. I was reading more, talking more about books. And it was there that I literally found the inspiration for The Snow Child. And this sounds like I'm making this up, but I swear this is how it happened. I was pregnant with our second daughter. It was a wintry, snowy night. And I was at the bookstore by myself, getting ready to close up. And I was shelving books. And I always imagined, daydreaming about being a bookseller, that I would just get to sit around and read books all the time at the bookstore. And it never happened. But as I was shelving, I came across this little children's paperback book called The Snow Child. It was illustrated by Barbara LaValle. And I've seen a couple copies. They have a copy at Writers and Books. I've seen it around. It's out of print now. But I had never seen it before, which surprised me because I had grown up in Alaska. I felt like I knew most Alaskan children's books. But I read it there, standing there before I closed up. And it was kind of a lightning bolt moment. I thought, this is it. This is the story I want to write. And I was so excited about it. But I had already invested 4.5 years into a completely different novel. And so I was really facing this dilemma. And again, I am if I commit to something, I'm going to finish it. So I felt like I should really finish this first novel. But I joke, I felt like a little bit like I was having an affair on my novel because I would go and put my 2 hours of writing time into the novel I was supposed to be writing, that I had hundreds of pages into. And then on the side, I would be over here researching the Snegorochka fairy tale. And that's the fairy tale told in Russia about an old man and a woman who can't have children. And one day they build a little girl out of snow and she comes to life. And I think, as I researched it, it had this tremendous rich history in Russia. An opera, a ballet, beautiful lacquer paintings on wooden boxes that show the scenes of this fairy tale. And I think what spoke to me about it was the first time I had come across a fairy tale that could take place in my backyard. Always growing up in Alaska, I loved a lot of books, but none of them really felt like they were a part of the life that I knew. I think the closest was Little House in the Big Woods, which was one of my very favorite stories. But I think this opened up this new possibility for me, that I could tell a story about Alaska, which is what I wanted to do, but I could let a little magic in. And it really just opened up this new possibility for me as a fiction writer. So eventually I said, I'm going to go for it. I abandoned that first novel and I started writing The Snow Child. And I had a first draft in about a year. And so I'm going to read a couple passages. The interesting thing about it, though, I think as a fiction writer, I have characters in my mind first. And then I have to kind of think, what's going to happen to these characters? Where are they going to go? With this, it was opposite. I had the plot handed to me. I had the skeleton of a fairy tale. But I had to figure out, who are these people? Why are they in Alaska? How did they come here? Why are they sad? How has it affected them to not be able to have children? And then how do their lives change when this little girl comes into their life? So that was part of the process for me, was getting to know Jack and Mabel. I think I'm going to start off reading a scene from Jack's perspective. So my main characters are Jack and Mabel. And Jack grew up as a farmer in Pennsylvania, but still isn't really prepared for life in Alaska. They come to Alaska sort of at a last-ditch effort at happiness, and I think that they're not really prepared for what they come across. And Jack has been considering going to work for the coal mine because their farm is failing, and he's not sure how they're going to get through the winter. But their neighbors, George and Esther, say, you should shoot a moose. You'll have moose meat, you've got potatoes, you'll get through the winter. Just don't go to the coal mine. And so Jack has been hunting very unsuccessfully for quite some time, and then has sort of an interesting moment in the woods. So I'm going to read, and actually I'm having it happen right now. I was telling someone that I was doing an event, one of my very first readings like this, and I had bookmarks in my book of where I was going to read, and they had fallen out. And it was kind of a very formal crowd, and I was very nervous up there flipping through, and my husband was standing in the back of the room, and he called out, "Honey, page 48." But he's not with me on this trip. He's home in Alaska. So I cheated and I wrote the page numbers on the inside cover so I'd be able to find where I wanted to read. So, all right, so I'll go and read this part this is from Jack's perspective. It was the quiet that pulled him out of his gloom, a quiet full of presence. He brought his head up. It was the child. She was before him, just a few yards away. She stood atop the snow, arms at her sides, the hint of a smile at her pale lips. White fur trimmed her coat and leather boots. Her face was framed by the velvety brown of a sable hat, and she wore Mabel's red scarf and mittens. The child was dusted in crystals of ice, as if she had just walked through a snowstorm or spent a brilliantly cold night outdoors. Jack would have spoken to her, but for her eyes. The broken blue of river ice, glacial crevasses, moonlight, they held him. She blinked, her blonde lashes glittering with frost, and darted away. "Wait," he called out. He stumbled after her. "Wait, don't be afraid." He was clumsy, tripping over his boots and kicking up snow. She sprinted ahead, but stopped often to look back at him. "Please," he called again, "wait." A sound came to Jack's ears, like wind stirring dried leaves or snow blowing across ice, or maybe a whisper from far away. "Shh." He did not call out again. He ducked beneath tree branches and waded through the snow as the girl led him farther and farther into the forest. He had to watch his feet to keep from tripping, but each time he looked up, she was waiting. And then she wasn't. He stopped, squinted, and scanned the tracks for her tracks. He saw no sign. Once again, he became aware of the quiet, the strange calm of the forest. From behind him came a high, chirpy whistle, like a chickadee's call, and he turned, expecting to see a bird, or maybe the child. Instead, a bull moose stood not 50 yards away. It raised its head slowly, as if the massive, many-pointed antlers were a ponderous burden. Snow sprinkled its nose and brown hackles. It swayed its antlers slowly, side to side. Never had Jack seen such a magnificent animal. On lanky legs, it must have stood more than 7 feet at the withers, and its neck was as stout as a tree trunk. In his wonder, Jack nearly overlooked the obvious. This was his quarry. And I have to say, earlier in this section that I didn't read to you, that I actually kind of meant to, he talks about that he feels doubt, kind of crouching over his shoulder, saying, "You are an old, old man." And now I'm both my husband are in our 40s now. And I start to think, maybe I shouldn't have talked about them being so old when they were in their late 40s, early 50s. That's not that old, is it? But the truth is I had to kind of play this fine line with them because they had to be old enough that they weren't going to have children, that they were well into their marriage, but young enough that maybe they could make a go of it as homesteaders in Alaska. And it does prove to be too much for them on their own, even though that I think Mabel really wants to do it all on their own. She realizes that she really can't. And the next scene I want to read is from Mabel's perspective, but it's about their neighbors, George and Esther. And I always say that I was so relieved when Esther came along. I mean, I do love Mabel, but she's kind of a downer. And there were times where I just thought, "Oh, Mabel, how are we going to get through this, dear?" And then, and it's funny because Esther wasn't a part, she's not part of the original fairy tale. She wasn't a part of my plan. I had sort of an outline. And suddenly she just sort of popped into the story. And I thought, "Oh, phew, okay, we're going to survive this after all." So the scene I'm going to read is that despite being resistant to any kind of interaction with other families, she really just wants her and Jack to do this on their own. Despite that, she kind of gets roped in to joining the Bensons, and it's Thanksgiving dinner, and they're over at George and Esther's house. So I'm going to just start reading it there. When they arrived at the Bensons, someone came out of the barn hoisting a flapping, headless turkey. It was George, she thought at first, but this person was too short and had a thick gray braid hanging below a wool cap. "Must be Esther," Jack said. "Do you think so?" The woman raised her chin in greeting, then wrestled with the huge dying bird in her arms. Blood splattered about her feet. "Go on up to the house," she called to them. "The boys will help you with the horse." In the cabin, Mabel sat alone at the cluttered kitchen table, while Jack disappeared outside with George and the younger son. With her hands in her lap, her back straight, she wondered where on earth they would eat. The table was heaped with stacks of catalogs, rows of washed empty jars, and bolts of fabric. The cabin smelled strongly of cabbage and sour wild cranberries. It wasn't much bigger than Jack and Mabel's, except it had a loft where she assumed the beds were. The cabin was catawampus in a dizzying way, with the floors dipping to one side and the corners not square. Rocks and bleached animal skulls and dried wildflowers lined the windowsills. Mabel didn't move, yet she pried just by allowing her eyes to wander. She jumped when the door banged open. Blasted bird. You'd think it'd know enough to give up the ghost, but no, it's got to raise hell when it doesn't even have a head left on its body. Oh dear. Can I do something to help? The woman stomped past the table without removing her dirty boots and threw the turkey onto the crowded counter. A lard tin fell with a clatter to the floor. Esther kicked at it and turned to Mabel, who stood flustered and slightly frightened. Esther grinned, stretched out a blood-stained hand. Mabel, isn't that it, Mabel? Mabel nodded and gave her hand over to Esther's vigorous shake. Esther, but I suppose you figured that out. Good to have you out here finally. Under her wool coat, Esther wore a flower print shirt and men's denim overalls. Her face was speckled with blood. She pulled off her wool hat, and fuzzy strands of hair stood on end. She swung her braid around her back and began filling a large pot of water. You'd think, with all these men around here, I could find somebody to kill and pluck a turkey for me, but no luck. Are you sure there's nothing I can do? Perhaps Esther would apologize for her appearance or for the disarray in the house. Maybe there was some explanation, some reason. No, just relax. Make yourself at home. You could fix us some tea if you'd like while I get this damn bird in the oven. Oh, yes, thank you. You know what our youngest went out and did? Here we raise a couple of turkeys for no other reason than to cook on occasions such as these, and he goes out and shoots a dozen ptarmigan yesterday. Let's have these for Thanksgiving, he says. What do I need a dozen dead ptarmigan for on Thanksgiving? Why feed turkeys if you're going to eat ptarmigan? She looked at Mabel as if expecting an answer. I haven't the faintest idea. I can't say I've ever eaten ptarmigan before. Well, it's good enough. For Thanksgiving, it's turkey as far as I'm concerned. I brought pies for dessert. I set them on that chair. I wasn't sure where else to put them. Perfect. I hadn't even had a chance to think about sweets. George tells me Betty's a fool to give up your pies. He raves about your baking. Not that he needs any of it. Have you seen the gut on that man? Again, she looked to Mabel expectantly. Oh, I wouldn't. Esther's laugh was a loud, startling guffaw. I keep telling him he's single-handedly supporting that hotel restaurant, and it's starting to show, she said. So I have to say, I get asked sometimes, like if there was inspiration for Mabel or for Jack, and not really. Those characters for me kind of developed out of the story of me trying to figure out who these people were. But Esther, for me, is sort of the quintessential Alaskan woman. She's tough but very caring. We have a few women like this in our neighborhood who show up and just sort of take over and help get everything done that needs to get done. So I'm always very, very glad to have Esther come along. So next part, I'm going to read. I think I'll read. It's been fun. I'm a little over halfway, maybe 3/4 of the way into my next manuscript that I'm working on for my next novel. And what was fun is, as I was writing The Snow Child, I really enjoyed writing the letters between Mabel and Ada. There was just something about getting to step into their voices. I just had so much fun, and I really wanted to write lots of them, but I realized they weren't the whole story, so I had to kind of pare it back. But it got me thinking as I started working on my next manuscript, and so I'm actually telling my new novel all through letters and journals and diaries, which is just a lot of fun. But I am going to read one of the letters. So Mabel grew up in a very different situation than Jack. She comes from a literature professor father and a much more kind of urban lifestyle, and she's the one being particularly adventurous, I think, and wanting to come to Alaska. And she's writing letters back to her sister Ada, who lives in the family home still. So I'm going to read one of those letters here, if I can find it. Great, here it is. Dear Mabel, your letters and sketches have become quite an attraction at our home. When everyone arrives, we host a dinner party and invite many of our closest friends and relatives. With your permission, I have read the letters aloud, and your sketches have been passed from one hand to the next, along with exclamations of, "Remarkable, such beauty." More than once, I have been told that you are the frontier equivalent of an Italian master studying human anatomy. Your sketches of the sable snarling teeth and clawed feet were among the favorites this last night, as were your studies of the alder cones and winter-killed grasses. Your letters, too, catch glimpses of this wild place that has become your home. You always did have a talent for expressing yourself, Mabel, and perhaps no other time in your life have you had such wondrous sights to express. Our only wish is that you would write more often. I do believe I will hold on to everything you send, and someday you should publish a book of your drawings and observations. There is something fanciful and yet feral about them. Along with your interest in this tale of the Snow Maiden, I am reminded of the time you spent as a child chasing fairies in the woods near our home. As I recall, you slept more than one night in those great oak trees, and when Mother found you the next morning, you would swear you had seen fairies that flew like butterflies and lit up the night like lightning bugs. I remember with some shame that the rest of us teased you about seeing such spirits. But now my own grandchildren chase similar fancies, and I do not discourage them. In my old age, I see that life itself is often more fantastic and terrible than the stories we believed as children, and that perhaps there is no harm in finding magic among the trees. Your loving sister, Ada. So I think I'm going to end with the reading there and maybe open it up to some questions and discussions if you're all up for it. I do have a few pages of my next manuscript too. If anybody requests, I'm happy to read from that a little bit to give you a taste of that. But I'm kind of hoping to just have some discussion about the book or any other questions you all might have. So, and I don't know if you guys have microphones out there. I think I'd repeat the question up there. Does anybody want to venture out forth? Yes, in the front there. Oh, yeah. So she asked, how did my parents end up in Alaska? So my mom grew up in Buffalo, actually, and I said my grandparents still live here. And my dad was an Army kid and ended up spending most of his childhood in Alabama. But they met in Colorado. And I think there are lots of different things that brought people to Alaska at that time in the 1970s. Some of it was the oil rush with the pipeline. But my parents were kind of more of the back-to-earth, wanting to live off the land type. And so they bought a little acre of land, had a garden, wanted to be able to hunt for our meat. So that's kind of how I grew up as a part of my lifestyle. And I often get asked if I did a lot of research for this book. And truly I didn't, because the lifestyle that Jack and Mabel are living is very much informed by my experiences growing up there as a kid. So yeah, I'm glad they ended up there. I kind of suspect I have a 14-year-old daughter who I think already has her eyes set on someplace outside of Alaska. So you never know. Great, thank you. Yes. Faina, but that took me a while to figure that out too. So. Yeah. Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'll tell you how it came about. As I was writing the book, there was a swan hunt allowed, and it's not a normal part of the hunting season in Alaska. It was out in western Alaska. And I think it might have been indigenous people were allowed to hunt swans. And I had this really kind of strange visceral reaction of like, oh, you're going to kill it. And it made me do a double take because I grew up hunting, and we hunt moose and caribou and bear, ptarmigan, grouse. And I thought, why am I having this reaction? And I think a lot of times, at least me as a writer, I'm curious about those places where there's a rub, where there's something that I don't quite understand. And I started thinking about the role of swans in fairy tales, girls who turn into swans that carry girls on their backs, different things. And then I thought, but how would Faina react with this one? And the truth is, she'd eat it if she could. But I found that an interesting kind of just throughout the book, I found an interesting conflict and friction between sort of ethereal fairy tale ideas that we have and sort of the gritty realities of survival in Alaska. But it's funny, when I had her skin out the pelt, I didn't know much about, because we usually, if we have grouse or something, we just eat the meat. We don't do anything with the pelts. So my husband's this great resource. I can ask him all kinds of strange questions, like, can you skin out a bird pelt? And he pointed out that indigenous people use feathered bird pelts often to make beautiful different garments or bags. So I had her skin it out, but I didn't know what she was going to do with it until I got to the wedding scene, and then I knew. And it felt like, to me, it just felt like enclosing of who she was in a lot of ways. So yeah, great question. Thank you very much for that. Any other questions out there? Yes, right here in the front. Oh, that's a great. She asked if I was a Shakespeare fan. I wish I knew more Shakespeare than I do. I played Lady Macbeth in high school, which seems a really long time ago now. But no, I certainly have read a lot of his things, but have not as. May I ask why you asked that? Right. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thank you for thinking that. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. Oh, well, thank you so much. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. She was talking about how Shakespeare often does that too, of juxtapositioning sort of harsh realities against these other things. So yeah, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. Any other questions? I see it in the back there. Yeah. Right. So that's a great question. So the question was about the ending and the last two words, it's snowing, and kind of my meaning with that and whether I intended a sequel. I can tell you I don't intend to do a sequel. It's funny because as much as I loved writing this book and I was very excited about it, to be completely honest, I'm kind of tired of the characters. I know it's a terrible thing to say, isn't it? But it feels like a really long time ago now. I think because I'm working on this new idea. It just feels very long ago. But it's funny that you mentioned those last words because those last words I had in my mind very early on as I was writing it. I kind of knew which version of the fairy tale I was going to follow. Those of you who've read it, there's several different endings, like a lot of fairy tales, and I knew fairly certain which way I was going to go. Now, and this is one of the most common questions I get, is there are people who do not like ambiguous endings, and my ending has been read as ambiguous. It's funny because I knew precisely what I thought happened. But I realized it was much more open-ended maybe than I intended. And at first, when I started attending book clubs and talking with readers, I would kind of explain my thought process and what I intended. And then I realized I shouldn't do that because it's a funny thing I realized that is once you read the book, it's your book. Like for me to say, oh no, you read that wrong. No, what? Then I wrote it wrong. If I didn't, it's like you. I think we all bring our own understandings of the world, our own everything to a book and experience it that way, and that's the experience. I can't change that. And I really realized that when my father-in-law read a very early draft of it, and he had very strong feelings about what the ending was, and I tried to kind of tell him that maybe I thought differently, and it wasn't working. And I realized that it doesn't matter. So not everyone loves that answer about the ending. I know some people do like concrete endings, and I didn't quite give that. So yeah, any other questions? Yeah, here. Right. Yeah, thank you so much for asking about that. It was a question about the quotation marks, the lack of quotation marks with Faina and her dialogue, and I'm really glad that you asked that. It's funny because and I shouldn't do this, but I do read my online reviews, and which is sort of a mixed blessing. And every once in a while, I'll see a review that says, "Wow, the book's all right," but there's all these punctuation errors, like typographical errors in the book about the quotation marks. I'm like, "Oh no, it was on purpose. Maybe it didn't work." But what happened with that is as I started writing Faina's dialogue and putting the quotation marks on her conversation, I just felt like I had somehow smacked her to the ground. I don't know how to explain it. Like suddenly she seemed very grounded and a little loud and just not the character that I wanted. And I'm a huge fan of Cormac McCarthy and some other writers who do really interesting things with dialogue. So I started experimenting. And it's one of the great things about modern word processing is it's really easy to say, okay, let's just take out all the quotation marks, And that didn't feel right. And then it struck me that maybe I could use that as a part of her character trait. And what I hoped was that it would kind of lend her this ethereal, quiet, subtle quality throughout it. And I did like it when people said that they at first wondered, is she real or not? Because I think Jack and Mabel feel a little bit that way. Now, the only risk I took in doing that, I think, is there are some people that even after they finish the book feel like they're not sure whether she was just a figment of their imagination. And while I wanted to be there a question, is she fairy tale being or human being, I didn't want there to be a question. She's definitely very much a part of their lives. So that was, sometimes you should do something, it doesn't always work the way you wanted. But thank you so much for asking that question. That's really great. And not everyone notices it. So yes, right there. Right. Oh, I'm so glad. You know, and that's good for me to know, because that's one thing, that's an element of the book. I never know whether to explain my intention with that or not. So the question is about, she suddenly Faina is able to be there in the summertime, and like that there's a logic problem there. But, and I'll just say, I don't know if this is a mistake or not, I'll say that, the different fairy tale versions, the one I chose is the one where she is a snow child, and she chooses mortality because she falls in love with a human boy. So that changes everything. It changes that she can be there in the summer, and it changes what can happen to her. So yeah, I don't know if I'm making a mistake into saying that, because other people have read it other ways, but that's really what I intended. And I tried to lay that out by laying out the potential fairy tales, that the way it could go. So that was it. But yeah, thank you for bringing that. Yes, right here. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, too. So this is about Faina's parents, more about them. And, it's funny, two things I'll say about this. One is that when I first wrote early draft of it, I had a lot of scenes from Faina's perspective, chapters from her perspective, that explained more of her life as a child, and how she could have learned to survive in the wilderness. Because I was a huge fan of like Island and the Blue Dolphins, Julie of the Wolves, these sort of survival kid stories. So I wanted to prove that a little girl could survive in Alaska. And as a part of that, I thought she would have to have a pretty tough, rough life with a father who was going to leave her to her own devices some, and then otherwise be an orphan without this father. So that was the track I took. And then my agent actually is the one, he read an early draft of it, and he said, I think maybe you should consider taking out those chapters from Faina's perspective. I think it would lend a lot more mystery to it. And I thought, which is a hard thing to do when you're talking about, dozens and dozens of pages that you've toiled over. But I was like, no, I think he's right. And so I took them all out. And it was funny because once I did that, I realized I'm not even sure they're true anymore. Like I know as much about Faina now as I put in the book, if that makes sense. So like I wanted it to be possible throughout the entire story, those two possibilities of she's either a human child who is really tough and knows how to survive in the Alaska wilderness, or she's a fairy tale being. And I had to kind of walk that line to try to keep both those possibilities alive throughout the whole story. So I tried to lay that groundwork by that there's this human father, and that's maybe potentially how it works. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, a little bit. Yeah. Any other? There in the back there? Yeah. Yeah, I think it was, my sense was that she had come into adolescence, and it was love. And it's interesting about the fox, that was another, and I always have to give credit where credit's due. Maybe there are authors out there who just write in a vacuum and don't have feedback from people and create brilliant things without anyone else's help. I was fortunate enough to have some really great readers who had insights that helped me to see things. So my editor didn't actually have a ton of changes for me, but one of them had to do with changing the order of and I always hesitate to tell too much in case some people haven't read it, but when the fox disappears, when that happens, it changes the potential between Faina and Garrett. Like it in a way, and I thought my editor had great insight. He's like her wild guardian in a way, and so things sort of change once the fox is gone as far as the potential between the two of them. But yeah, thank you for that question. I appreciate it. Yes, right here. Yeah. No, so the question is about Jack and Mabel's relationship. And it's interesting because even though it's called The Snow Child, I really feel like it's their story. It's the story of their marriage, of their lives together. And I guess I just, over the years, both older couples and younger couples, and in my own relationships, I think that lack of communication can create so much misunderstanding. And I think with Jack and Mabel, they're each thinking, I'm going to be the tough one. I've got to be the one that makes this work. And they're not talking about their grief and not talking about what they've been through. So part of what really the book came about to me is about how they learn to communicate with each other and also how they learn to cope with grief. And so in the end, that lesson comes back to them in a different form, but now they have the capability to talk about it maybe. So yeah, I hope that they would kind of grow as a couple during that process. Absolutely. Yes, any others? Yes, right here. Right. So the question is about magic realism in the book. And it's interesting because I think Robert Goulrick might have been the first one. He had done an author who read an early version of it and gave me an endorsement. And he described it as magic realism and compared it to Marquez, which of course is hugely flattering. But I don't know that I actually think of it as magic realism in a way. I guess maybe for me that calls to mind more the South American authors where it's like people flying and and for me, I felt like I wanted to be a very real story with just this touch of potential magic. That there was, if you want to believe, there's the potential that something magic is going on here, but maybe not. Maybe it's just people surviving, and so I like that idea that there could be a little bit of potential magic, and I think that's what seeing that fairy tale book opened up that possibility for me. But I wasn't ready to write something truly like fantasy, like that's just not my genre. So yeah, does that kind of answer your question a little bit? Yeah. Right. And this is the question about the snow not melting on her hand. Yeah, and I felt like I had to walk this thin line. I wanted a little bit of that, but I didn't want to take it too far, and I did want it to be very rooted in reality. And basically, mostly I wanted to write about Alaska as a place, a place where people come and think that they're going to build a certain kind of life and end up having this a hard struggle. So that was kind of really the most what I wanted to write about. But I like the idea that maybe there's just a little bit of magic, right? Because in fiction, you can do whatever you want. Yes, they're in the back. Yes. Oh, that's so the question's about that manuscript that I abandoned. And if there's any writers in the audience, I apologize for saying this, but it will never see the light of day. It was my practice run, which is kind of a daunting thing to say to writers. But the truth is I talk to other authors, this is really common, that either you write a first book and you end up abandoning it, or it doesn't ever make it to the marketplace, or you rewrite that first book so many times that it really doesn't resemble the one you started with. I think at least I needed that learning process of learning how to work with characters and fiction and plot that I hadn't done in journalism writing. That being said, I really was very attached to my characters from that story. I had plot problem, basically didn't have a plot, which I like books that don't have plots sometimes, but they're a little harder to get other people interested in. But the characters I really loved. And so I've actually had fun writing some short stories with them. I don't usually write a lot of short stories because they don't seem fully developed to me. But because these characters seem so real, I could kind of put them into short stories. And so it was not a total waste by any means. But it'll never be out there. Any other questions? Yes, right here. Oh, yes. Yeah. No, this is really interesting because this is about kind of the universal theme of old couple or a couple not being able to have children and build. And it was so funny because once I started working on it, when you're doing something and all of a sudden you see it everywhere, I was like, Pinocchio, the gingerbread man. I mean, it really is it's a really common theme. And there's a great book, I think it's called Rain Babies, which is the same idea of this couple catching these little raindrops that end up being a baby. And so, yeah, I think it is a really common theme out there. And it's interesting because we're very fortunate. We have two daughters that we love very much. But early on, we had a hard time getting pregnant. So I went through this time of wondering, I think a lot of times fiction writing is about empathizing and imagining out farther. And I've had some people say, well, are you saying that all women have to have children to be happy? And no, not at all. For me, though, I was trying to understand that feeling of what would it be like if you really did want to have children and you couldn't, and what would that be like, and what would it be like to lose a child? So it was kind of trying to empathize with those experiences a little bit. But yeah, I think you're right that it's funny. There's some really. It's called Vanka and the Dragon. Is that what you said? V. Okay, yeah, I'll have to look for it. That's really great. Thank you. Yes, right there. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, thank you. This is a comment about the ending, and it was funny. I was just telling the last audience I was speaking to that I was at a book event, and this very nice couple came up to me, and the woman whispered to me, and she said, my husband didn't like your book very much. He liked it at the beginning, but then he was very sad at the end, and he didn't like it. And I thought for a second, I said, did he read the epilogue? And no, he couldn't. He didn't. He was tired of the book by then. And I said, oh no, go back and read the epilogue. I promise you, there's a little glimmer of happiness and hope. I promise. I felt terrible though, even left in agony over it. Yes. Oh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No. Yeah, thank you for that insight. It was sort of, she's talking about the contrast between Mabel and Faina as mothers. And I do think there's this kind of unfortunate thing that happens a lot in the world, that people who really, really want children can't have them, and some people that don't want them or aren't equipped to have them. You know, it's just sort of this thing. And I was kind of interested in this. I think as a mother myself, interested in the idea of motherhood and of parenting. I think Jack and Mabel always wanted a child, and then it's like, oh, wait, this is a little more complicated than we thought having a kid. All the things that, as a mother of a 14-year-old, all the things that it brings with it as parenthood, you know, it's a challenge at times. So yeah, thank you though. That's very insightful. Yes, right here. Oh, that's a great question. It's about my next book. So yeah, it is set in Alaska. And again, I decided to do it through journals and letters and documents. And what I did, it's not a sequel to The Snow Child, but I kept the Wolverine River, which I had invented. It's very much inspired by the Matanuska River and the Copper Rivers that are in south central Alaska. But as I started writing The Snow Child, I realized I was getting kind of obsessed with real geography and real history. And it was getting to be sort of like too much focus was getting put on that. And I thought, wait a minute, this is fiction. I can do whatever I want. So I invented the Wolverine River, which I think has caused some consternation to readers who have been looking for it on the atlas. And I feel I should have put an author's note in there or something. There are some Wolverine rivers in Alaska, but they're way out in western Alaska. So anyways, I'm keeping that imaginary river. But I'm going back to a true life. There was an expedition in 1885 that went up. It was a military expedition of 3 men who went up the Copper River, over the mountains, and flew down the Tanana and the Yukon River. And they called it the Lewis and Clark of Alaska. It was an amazing expedition. And it was sort of the first European-American transversing of Alaska. So I'm fictionalizing this account. I'm telling the same story, but with fictional characters and some mythological encounters along the way. So I realized I had a lot of fun talking about the place I love, but having some creative fun with it. So I'm working on it. It's called Shadows on the Wolverine, and we'll see. Fingers crossed that it'll. Yes.
What difference is it between that time frame and today?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I'll tell you, with The Snow Child, I often get asked why I set it at the time frame that I did in 1918. 1920 is when it actually starts, but they moved there in 1918. And for me, part of it was that I realized if I set it in modern Alaska, there'd be certain authorities that would be involved if there was a little girl running through the trees. And suddenly I was envisioning helicopters and, Health and Family Services investigating. And I was like, oh, no, this doesn't work. And part of it, too, is sort of the aesthetic. Like I said, I love Little House on the Prairie books and the feeling of lantern light. And I don't know, there's a certain coziness, I think, about that lifestyle. And there is some of that in Alaska still. But the truth is modern Alaska, you can have as many conveniences you want. You could live in a house in Anchorage that's exactly like any other house. We have Wi-Fi. We have, we now at our house have running water and electricity, which is a wonderful thing. So you can kind of have the extremes there. There are still a lot of people who live very rural lifestyles, but a lot of people that just live very modern ones as well. So yeah, thank you. And my new book, I'm actually having to do a lot of research. This one I didn't do so much, but 1885, it's going far enough back that there are a lot of things that were very different. So I'm doing a lot of research for that one, which is fun. Yes?
At any point in your writing were you tempted to let Faina live? What did that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. As I was writing the book, I remember at one point, because my husband's the one I often talk to about plot ideas, and I would often come down and read the chapters I was working on. And I had this point where I said, can't we just keep Faina? Can't I? Because I didn't want to let. It was actually kind of an emotional thing for me, and I think partly because as I was working on the book, you might notice in my acknowledgments at the very end, I acknowledged Laura McDonald. She was a very good friend of mine. We had gone to school together. We both were interns at the Frontiersman newspaper together, the same age, had daughters the same age. She died of cancer as I was writing the book. And I actually delivered her eulogy in our small town. And it was sort of this realization of what Jack and Mabel, of grief, that we want things to be different. We want everyone in our lives who are important to us to always be there. But we may be able to choose happiness, but we can't choose our own endings. I talk a little bit that in the book, that things happen in our lives. So as much as I kind of wanted to just, it is my book, I can do whatever I want, right? I can keep her here. But I just felt like that wasn't the story. And so it was actually kind of hard for me to write. But I knew those lines, it's snowing. I knew that was with me from the beginning. So yeah, that's a great question, though. Thank you. Yes, any other questions? Yes, they're in the back. Oh, sure. So this is about the writing process. I'm so fortunate to have a husband who's really supportive, because it was a crazy time when I decided, hey, I should write this book. We had just bought this recreational cabin fixer-upper that had no running water, no wiring. It was just half finished, and I was pregnant, and we both were working jobs, and I was going to write this book. And so luckily, my husband said, he's always believed in my writing, has always supported me, and he said, I'm going to give you 2 hours every night, just go upstairs and write. I'll put the girls to bed, you just go write. This was after our baby was born. And so I had these 2 hours every night, and I actually think it worked really well because I felt like I had a timer. I mean, that was the time I had, and it was a gift to me. Like, I couldn't abuse that. I always joke that I couldn't go upstairs and with a good conscience, like, play solitaire on the computer. You know, like, I had to do something because I was getting this time. So that was how my writing time worked then, and I really worked. I had this sort of outline. I had a lot of scene ideas, and I just kind of worked through chronologically. And my mom and I had a great deal together. She was working on her poetry and getting more into it, and she wanted to commit to writing a poem a week. And I said, okay, how about this? I will give you a draft chapter every week, and you give me a poem, and we can only say good things about it. So, you know, a lot of editing critique groups, it's like, oh, this is terrible. And both of us knew these were just little embryos of things. You know, we couldn't say, we were just encouraging each other. So I'd say, oh, I love this part of it. And it was actually really helpful to know what was working rather than what wasn't working. And so we changed every week, and that was kind of how I worked on it. And went relatively quickly. In a year, I had a strong first draft. So that was kind of the process that I went through with that. Now I'm on a new thing of trying to write 500 words a day. You know, you always try these tricks to try to get yourself on a schedule. So that's my new program. Yes, any other questions? Yes. Yeah, my publication process was so crazy, I thought. You know, I worked at the bookstore for, almost 10 years. So I thought I understood how the publishing world worked. I had been to conferences and things. What happened is I was probably 3/4 of the way done with the manuscript. It was the summer after I had discovered the fairy tale book. My mom and I went to Catchmack Bay Writers Conference in Homer. And we had just gone to attend the craft sessions, meet other writers, get inspired. But when I was there, I saw that Jeff Kleinman of Folio was the presenting agent. And I recognized some of his books, Art of Racing in the Rain, Finn, some books I knew and liked. I thought, wow, this guy's in Alaska? Like, this is the real deal. So my mom convinced me to go and talk to him about my manuscript. And basically on the first 100 pages, he offered to represent it. But then it was a really long process. I mean, it was, maybe another year before I had a draft that he was happy with. And then he said, let's wait a while. The recession's really bad right now. Publishers are kind of, tentative about buying debut fiction. Let's wait like a year. What? Wait, sit on it for a year, So then eventually he took it out to Little Brown and Company. A few different editors. Little Brown came back quickest and said, we want it. And then, crazy, it sold to multiple publishers around the world at the same time. So the whole process was nuts. Totally unexpected. One more question, it sounds like. We're on the, yes, over here. Oh, that's a dangerous question to ask the bookseller. You guys got some time? Well, okay, I'll say as a writer, the book that just blew me away, and I thought, I wish I could write like this, was Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich. I read it in college, and I just was overwhelmed by it. But that being said, there's some really wonderful Alaskan writers. Two Old Women is actually one I'm going to recommend. I hope that you guys can read sometime. It's an Alaskan artist, Velma Wallace wrote it, and it's a very simple kind of fable story. It's just beautiful and amazing about Alaska. I could go on and on. There's some really great books, but I'll leave it there for now. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate you all coming out tonight. Really wonderful. Thank you.
Before you run out, a few quick announcements. If you have filled out your form with quote, questions we've asked, as you're leaving, there'll be people with green bags. You can drop that in there, and if you have an envelope, you could drop that in there also. We will have a reception in the back part of the library, and Eowyn will be there to sign copies of the books. Books will be for sale. And if you need, if you were going to make a contribution and you need a credit card, there is a credit card processing stand back there too. So thank you all for coming. And again, what a wonderful book and a wonderful author, Eowyn.